Fear is the oldest prayer of humankind. Long before we carved our gods into stone, before the whisper of scripture passed from mouth to mouth, there was the trembling of the body in the dark, the gasp in the night, the sense that something vast, merciless, and unseen was pressing against us. Fear is the beginning of all faith because it is the first acknowledgement that there is something greater than ourselves, something we cannot control. But fear, left untended, mutates. It grows teeth. It borrows the language of devotion, and soon what we call faith may no longer be a guiding light, but a weapon, sharpened against anyone who dares not tremble the same way we do. This paradox beats at the heart of Salem's lot, but it also beats in every town, in every heart, in every desperate moment where morality buckles under the weight of survival. Fear has always been a currency of control. Leaders, priests, fathers, and even frightened neighbors pass it around like money. It is easier to frighten someone into obedience than to reason with them. Easier to conjure visions of damnation than to nurture compassion. In Salem's lot, the townsfolk were already brittle before the vampire ever set foot in their streets. They were split by gossip, weakened by jealousy, half drunk on their own loneliness. Fear seeped into the cracks long before the true horror arrived. That's how terror works. It doesn't enter through locked doors. It slips under the threshold of resentment, pride, guilt, and isolation. And once it finds its way inside, it doesn't ask for permission. It demands faith. But what is faith if not the attempt to make sense of fear? A man kneeling at the altar may be less devoted than desperate. A woman clutching a crucifix to her chest may be clinging not to God, but to the illusion that someone, anyone, is listening in the void. In Salem's lot, crosses become talismans not because of divine command, but because belief itself carries a strange, volatile electricity. A cross works only in the trembling hand of one who truly believes, in the grip of the doubtful. It is just wood and metal, useless against the dark. Faith here is not a shield, but a mirror, exposing whether the believer is truly convinced or merely pretending. And that is where faith begins to sharpen into a weapon, when we use it not to protect ourselves, but to judge the trembling of others. The psychology of a mistake is never born in one moment. It grows like a mold in the damp corners of the mind. Consider how quickly the townspeople in Salem's lot shifted from suspicion to accusation, from whispers to the comfort of blame. It is easier to point at the neighbor and call them cursed than to admit the terror might be inside your own home. That is the first crime of faith, the way it teaches us to divide the saved from the damned, the chosen from the forsaken. We forget that this division was never ordained. It was born of our own fear, our own hunger to feel safe. Safety always comes at the expense of someone else's exile. And yet, the cruel irony is that true evil does not need to shout. It thrives in silence, in complicity, in the moments when we tell ourselves it's not our problem. A vampire doesn't need to break down the door when the neighbors are too afraid to scream, too ashamed to admit what they've seen. Evil lives in hesitation. It lives in the seconds between hearing a cry and deciding not to answer it. And this is where criminal psychology and the psychology of ordinary mistakes blur into one. Most atrocities are not committed by monsters, but by people who convince themselves they are powerless, or worse, righteous. Fear becomes faith. Faith becomes justification. and justification becomes a blade that cuts deeper than any fang. Still, beneath this darkness is the unbearable truth that humans long for meaning, even in suffering. Fear tells us we are small. Faith tells us we are chosen. When the people of Salem's lot clutch their crosses, when they recite half-remembered verses, they are not only defending against monsters, they are asserting that their terror is not meaningless. They are telling themselves that even if they die, there is a reason. Yet when reason is replaced with blind obedience, faith stops being a light in the dark and instead becomes a torch used to burn down the homes of the unbelievers. The line between devotion and destruction is paper thin, and history has shown us again and again how quickly the faithful can become the executioners. Here lies the emotional struggle of every human heart. Do we let fear teach us humility, or do we let it drive us to cruelty? Do we use faith to steady ourselves in chaos, or do we use it to sharpen our suspicion against others? When we laugh at the strange neighbor, when we whisper about the family who doesn't attend church, when we call someone cursed instead of asking if they are lonely, aren't we already opening the door to the very evil we claim to resist? In Salem's lot, the vampires feasted on more than blood. They feasted on isolation, hypocrisy, and the desperate hunger for certainty. Every mistake begins with an emotion we refuse to face honestly. Fear of being powerless becomes a lust for control. Fear of death becomes a hunger for immortality. Fear of difference becomes hatred dressed up as righteousness. And once we commit the first small cruelty in the name of survival, it becomes easier to commit the next. The snowball grows. By the time the town burns, no one can remember whether it was the monster or the people themselves who struck the match. And so we arrive at the question no one dares ask. If faith requires fear to be born, does it also require blood to survive? If belief only proves itself in the face of danger, then do we unconsciously seek out enemies, invent devils, conjure threats, so that we can feel certain in our faith? Maybe this is why humanity never runs out of monsters, if none exist. We will invent them, because to lose fear is to risk losing faith. And to lose faith is to be left alone with ourselves, with no shield, no justification, no excuse for what we have done or failed to do. But what if, just for a moment, we dared to face the darkness without a weapon in hand? What if we allowed fear to make us tender instead of cruel? Could faith then become something other than a blade? Could it become compassion, courage, the kind of light that does not scorch but guides? Or are we too far gone, too in love with our weapons, too addicted to the feeling of righteousness that comes only when someone else is on their knees before us? Tell me, when fear becomes faith and faith becomes a weapon, what have you sacrificed in the process? And when the silence of the night presses against your chest, when you hear the faintest knocking at your door, will you open it with compassion or with a crucifix sharpened into a stake? Fear is never static. It mutates, writhes, and adapts. The way a virus changes its shape until the medicine meant to cure it becomes useless. What began as an instinct for survival becomes a way of life, a philosophy, even a culture. In Salem's lot, the townspeople were infected long before the vampires arrived. Their faith was already steeped in the suspicion that others were unworthy. That sin was crouching behind every door. And so when the true darkness came, it did not have to fight its way in. It was welcomed, because it confirmed what they already suspected, that the world was cruel, and people deserved punishment. Fear had written the script long before blood stained the pages. Criminal psychology teaches us something uncomfortable. Most crimes are not committed in cold calculation, but in the fever of emotion. A husband strikes in anger. A thief steals in desperation. A neighbor betrays another in envy. But what makes these acts endure, what gives them the weight of permanence, is not the emotion itself. It is the justification we lace around it afterward. Fear without explanation is unbearable, but fear wrapped in faith, fear given a holy name, becomes something we can live with. It becomes something we can repeat. That is why entire communities can become accomplices to evil while still believing themselves righteous, because they are no longer acting out of panic. They are acting out of faith, and in that warped mirror, every crime looks like obedience. Think of how the cross, a symbol of suffering and sacrifice, becomes both a lifeline and a weapon in Salem's lot. In the trembling hands of a believer, it can ward off darkness. But the same symbol, in another's grasp, can be pressed against the throat of the doubter, a brand of condemnation. This duality is not fantasy. It is the echo of every war waged in the name of God. Every execution carried out with scripture on the lips of the executioner. Faith is only as merciful as the hands that wield it. And human hands are notoriously unsteady. When fear drives them, they shake. When pride drives them, they clench. When cruelty drives them, they close into fists. And what of the individual? The quiet soul who is swallowed whole by this machinery of collective terror. Inside each person, the battle is not between good and evil, but between fear and compassion. The man who refuses to speak up when his neighbor vanishes is not inherently wicked. He is paralyzed by fear, terrified that by defending another, he will mark himself for death. The woman who whispers gossip about a friend is not evil. She is clutching at the illusion of safety, believing that if blame is assigned elsewhere, it will never land at her door, but moment by moment, decision by decision, the fabric of morality unravels. This is how mistakes become legacies, how small betrayals add up to burned towns and broken generations. The tragedy of Salem's lot is not that monsters exist. It is that ordinary people, when faced with terror, become collaborators in their own destruction. They trade compassion for survival, truth for safety, humanity for the fleeting comfort of belonging to the faithful, and in doing so, they create the perfect ecosystem for evil to thrive. A vampire does not need to command them to betray each other. They do it willingly. Each betrayal disguised as devotion. Fear becomes faith. Faith becomes law. Law becomes violence. And by the end, no one remembers where the cycle began. But perhaps the most terrifying revelation is not about the town at all. It is about us. Because Salem's lot is not just a story. It is a mirror. It asks us to look at our own neighborhoods, our own beliefs, and see whether we too have confused fear for faith. It asks whether we are already sharpening our crosses into stakes, ready to pierce the hearts of those who believe differently, live differently, love differently. It asks whether the evil we most fear is not prowling outside our windows, but already whispering inside our thoughts. So we are left with a choice, and choices are always the crucible of psychology. When the moment of terror comes, when the darkness outside our homes presses close, when the easy path is to condemn, to accuse, to strike first, what will we do? Will we let fear dictate our faith? Or will we risk the unbearable act of compassion? Because compassion, unlike faith born of fear, demands sacrifice. It demands that we open the door when we would rather barricade it. It demands that we risk our own safety for the sake of another. And in that risk lies the only true victory over terror. But we resist compassion because it offers no guarantee. Faith promises salvation, even if it is false. Fear promises survival, even if it is temporary. Compassion promises only that we will face the darkness together. And for many, that feels too fragile, too uncertain. Yet perhaps that is the point. Perhaps faith that is not sharpened into a weapon is not meant to make us feel invincible, but vulnerable. Perhaps its power lies not in conquering death, but in reminding us that we are not alone in the face of it. And so the question remains, one you must ask yourself in the quiet hours when no one is watching, when the darkness comes knocking. What will you reach for first? A weapon or a hand? Fear whispers most loudly in isolation. It grows teeth in silence, feeding on the corners of the mind where no one else can see. In Salem's lot, the townspeople are not united in love or compassion. They are united in secrecy, in the careful avoidance of each other's eyes, in the quiet surrender to something they cannot name. This is the emotional truth of horror. It does not require claws or fangs. It requires distance, suspicion, the cold refusal to reach for another human being when everything inside you is screaming to hide. And that is the moment where fear becomes its most insidious weapon, not when it drives you to scream or run, but when it convinces you to remain still, silent, obedient. The greatest crimes in history have not been committed by the few who shouted orders, but by the millions who said nothing, who believed that silence would save them. Fear has always known this secret, that it does not need to destroy you outright. It only needs to make you believe that courage is impossible. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act while fear still gnaws at your bones. This is why so few people manage it, and why those who do are remembered as extraordinary. In Salem's lot, courage is not shown by those who cling most tightly to their crosses, but by those who dare to face the darkness without certainty, who risk the possibility that their faith may fail them. There is something profoundly human in that trembling bravery, the knowledge that you may be swallowed whole, and the insistence on standing anyway. Yet here lies the paradox. Fear and faith both crave certainty, but life offers none. And so we invent stories, scriptures, rituals, talismans, anything to bind the chaos into something we can hold. Sometimes, these inventions give us strength. Other times, they give us excuses. We forget that every symbol we raise in defiance of the dark can also be raised against each other. The cross, the flag, the book, all of them become double-edged, able to guide or to wound depending on the heart of the one who wields them. The weapon is never in the object itself, but in the trembling hand that grips it. This is the great emotional struggle of being human. The need to belong clashing with the need to be true. Faith offers belonging, but it often demands conformity. Compassion offers truth, but it often leads to exile. So we compromise. We tell ourselves we are kind, even as we avert our eyes from suffering. We tell ourselves we are faithful, even as we condemn the stranger at the edge of the town. These are not small mistakes. They are the seeds of every great betrayal. A town does not burn in a single night. It burns in whispers, in shrugged shoulders, in the decision to stay inside while someone else screams, and still, within us, there remains that flicker, that tiny defiance that refuses to let fear be the final word. Perhaps that is what Stephen King understood so well, that horror is not only about monsters, but about whether we will choose to face them together or die alone in silence. Salem's Lot is less a story about vampires than it is a story about us, the fragile, frightened, stumbling creatures who must decide every day whether to let fear rule us, or whether to risk everything for the sake of compassion. So let us ask the question that no sermon, no scripture, no ritual can answer for us when the darkness calls your name, when it knocks on your door with the gentleness of a friend and the hunger of a predator. What will you do? Will you reach for your faith, sharpened into a weapon, and strike at whatever you do not understand? Or will you risk the unbearable act of opening your door, not with a stake in your hand, but with compassion trembling in your chest? Because in the end, the monsters are not the test. We are. The terrible thing about fear is how intimate it becomes. It doesn't only haunt the empty streets or echo in the church pews. It slips into the bed with you, breathes down your neck, nestles inside the very marrow of your bones. In Salem's Lot, the vampire is not frightening simply because it drinks blood. It is frightening because it asks, what would you do to survive? Would you betray a neighbor, sacrifice a friend, shut the blinds while the town burns, if it meant your children lived another night? Fear is not content with shadows outside the window. It forces you to confront the shadows inside your soul. That is the essence of the criminal mistake, not one grand decision, but a slow erosion of conscience. We like to believe evil comes with horns and claws, obvious and grotesque, so we can point to it and say, there, that is not me. But in truth, evil looks like hesitation, like the pause between hearing a cry for help and deciding whether to respond. It looks like relief when the victim is someone else, like silence when your voice could have mattered. The psychology of wrongdoing is not alien. It is familiar, almost comfortable, because it is born from the same soil as our desire to protect, to survive, to endure, and faith, twisted by fear, makes this erosion palatable. A man does not betray because he is wicked. He betrays because he convinces himself it is God's will, or fate's decree, or the law of survival. A mother does not close the curtains because she lacks love. She does so because she tells herself her family must come first. In this way, faith becomes the balm that soothes the conscience even as it sharpens the knife. Salem's Lot is littered with these small, ordinary tragedies, people doing what they must, only to discover they have become what they feared. But if fear poisons, it also reveals, strip away the illusions, the rituals, the sanctuaries, and what remains is the raw, trembling core of the human spirit. It is here that we glimpse the paradox. Fear is both the engine of cruelty and the birthplace of courage. Faith is both the hand that condemns and the whisper that steadies us. The cross burns only in the grasp of the believer. The stake pierces only in the hand of the desperate. Every symbol holds both possibilities, and the choice of which it becomes is ours. This choice is never comfortable. To embrace compassion in the face of terror feels unnatural, even reckless. It demands we surrender control, step into uncertainty, and admit that survival at any cost is not the highest good. But imagine for a moment if the people of Salem's Lot had done just that, if instead of dividing, whispering, accusing. They had gathered, not with weapons raised, but with hands joined. Would the vampire have found such easy purchase in their fear? Or would the darkness have recoiled from the one thing it cannot feast upon? A community bound not by terror, but by love. The tragedy is that we will never know. And perhaps that is the truest horror of all, that we so rarely choose compassion when fear offers us an easier faith. We would rather carry weapons than burdens, rather sharpen our crosses than risk our hearts. And so the darkness wins. Again and again, not because it is stronger, but because we mistake survival for salvation. And you, sitting here, listening, remembering your own silences, your own choices, are you any different? When you think back to the moment you could have spoken but didn't, to the person you could have defended but abandoned, do you feel the weight of that hesitation? Do you still convince yourself it was the only way? Or do you wonder what might have happened if you had chosen differently? Because that is where the story turns inward. Salem's Lot is not just a town. It is every place where people let fear dictate their faith. Where silence grows louder than compassion. The monsters may change their faces, their names, their weapons. But the question remains the same. When fear becomes faith and faith becomes a weapon, what will you do? Will you add your silence to the chorus? Or will you risk breaking it? There is a moment in every nightmare when the dreamer realizes the terror is not coming from outside at all, but from within. Salem's Lot presses that realization into our chests like a burning brand. The vampire is terrifying, yes, but what it awakens in the townspeople is far worse. They become reflections of the very creature they fear, predatory in their suspicion, ravenous in their hunger for certainty, ruthless in their pursuit of survival. And when we look closely enough, we see ourselves in them, because fear makes us all capable of wearing the mask of the monster. Psychologists tell us that human beings will do nearly anything to avoid the feeling of helplessness. It is not pain we fear most, but powerlessness, the sense that we are at the mercy of forces too vast to fight. Faith arises as an answer to this unbearable helplessness. It tells us we are not abandoned, that there is meaning even in suffering. But when fear infects faith, helplessness doesn't disappear. It festers. Disguised as righteousness, people cling more fiercely to symbols, to rituals, to rules, not because they are certain, but because they are desperate. The more fragile the belief, the sharper the weapon it creates. And here lies the subtle cruelty of social dynamics. Fear never exists alone. It spreads, it echoes, it multiplies in whispers and side glances. One person's panic becomes another's paranoia, until an entire community breathes the same poisoned air. We might think of Salem's Lot as cursed ground, but is it truly different from any other place where fear has been allowed to grow unchecked? Replace the vampire with an enemy, a scapegoat, an outsider, and the story repeats itself endlessly in human history. Fear creates faith. Faith creates division. And division sharpens into violence. The tools may change, but the wound is always the same. What then is the alternative? It cannot be to rid ourselves of fear. That is impossible, and perhaps even unwise. Fear alerts us to danger, quickens the blood, sharpens the mind. It is the spark that ignites our most primal instincts. The question is not whether we fear, but what we allow fear to shape in us. Does it drive us inward, closing our fists and shuddering our hearts? Or does it remind us of our shared fragility, our desperate need for one another, our common fate in the face of darkness? Courage is not the absence of trembling. It is the willingness to tremble together. Imagine the townspeople of Salem's lot, gathered not in suspicion, but in solidarity, refusing to let the night divide them. Imagine if faith had been stripped of its weaponry and returned to its simplest form, the act of believing in each other. The vampire's hunger would still have been real, the danger still immense, but perhaps the story would not have ended in ashes. Perhaps it would have revealed a different truth, that darkness is powerful, yes, but never invincible when human hearts refuse to fracture. And here is where the story twists the knife into us, the listeners. Because we know that in our own lives, in our own towns, in our own families, we have not always chosen solidarity. We have chosen silence. We have chosen suspicion. We have chosen the easier path of protecting ourselves at the expense of others. And each time we do, we feed the darkness, not a mythical vampire, but the very real shadow that grows whenever compassion dies. So the question lingers like smoke in a burned-out house. When the moment comes for you, will you recognize it? Will you see the knock at your door for what it is, not just a test of your fear, but of your faith? And will your faith be a weapon? Or will it be a hand stretched out in trembling defiance of the night? Because perhaps the true terror is not that the monsters exist, but that, when they come, we so often help them win. There is a peculiar cruelty in the way fear reshapes memory. Once the danger has passed, once the bodies are buried and the smoke has cleared, people tell themselves stories to soften the sharp edges of what they did or what they failed to do. They remember their silence as wisdom, their hesitation as prudence, their betrayal as necessity. This is how a town like Salem's Lot dies twice, first in flames, and then in the lies its people tell themselves about why the flames were inevitable. Memory becomes another weapon, wielded not against monsters this time, but against truth. And what is truth in such a place? It is fragile, slippery, almost unbearable to hold. Truth is the neighbor who begged for help while shutters slammed closed. Truth is the child who was left behind because saving her meant risking too much. Truth is the recognition that the monsters won not because they were stronger, but because people surrendered to their own terror. Criminal psychology calls this rationalization, but in the language of the soul, it is simply cowardice dressed as survival. Yet even in the ashes, something stirs. It is the faint glimmer of self-awareness. The realization that fear is not invincible, that the choice was always there, hidden beneath the layers of instinct and panic. And this realization cuts deep, because it asks a question no one wants to face. If you could go back, would you act differently, or would you, even knowing the outcome, still cling to your faith as a shield, still sharpen it into a weapon, still convince yourself that compassion was too costly? The irony is that the very fragility we fear admitting is the source of our greatest strength. Faith corrupted by fear makes us rigid, brittle, prone to shatter. But faith that admits its own trembling, faith that acknowledges its weakness, becomes something else entirely. It becomes tender, porous, alive. It stops trying to conquer death and instead chooses to walk alongside it, whispering that even in the shadow of mortality, love is possible. Such faith cannot be weaponized because it has no interest in conquest. It seeks not to dominate, but to endure. But enduring together is terrifying because it means trusting each other. It means opening our doors instead of bolting them, sharing food instead of hoarding it, raising our voices instead of silencing them. It means embracing the possibility that survival is less important than humanity. And this is where most falter, where the people of Salem's lot faltered, where we falter too. We would rather live as shadows than risk dying as ourselves. We would rather be survivors than be human. The lesson is merciless, but it is also liberating. The monsters we fear most are not outside our walls. They are the choices we make when those walls begin to tremble. And if that is true, then we are never powerless, no matter how dark the night becomes. We may not be able to stop the knock at the door, but we can decide how we answer it. With fear, or with faith, or with a weapon, or with compassion. So I leave you with this. When the night presses close and the silence grows unbearable, when your heart beats like a drum and every instinct screams to protect yourself first, will you choose the easier faith that divides and condemns, or the harder faith that unites and risks everything? When fear becomes faith and faith becomes a weapon, will you let history repeat itself, or will you be the one trembling voice that says no? And if that moment has already come for you, if you've already chosen silence, already turned away, what will you do when it comes again? The most unsettling truth is that the moment will always come again. Darkness is not a visitor that arrives once and leaves us forever changed. It is a cycle, a rhythm, a tide that rises again and again to test the shorelines of our humanity. Salem's lot burned, yes, but does not every town carry within it the seeds of its own undoing? Fear waits in every alley, every pulpit, every whispered rumor. It is patient, tireless, always searching for a fracture in the human spirit to slip through. And if we are honest, the fracture is already there. Each of us carries loneliness like a hidden wound. Each of us harbors envy, resentment, shame. These are not weaknesses unique to one cursed town. They are universal, which means the story of Salem's lot is not a fable about monsters in Maine. It is a warning about us, about how easily we allow our own wounds to be exploited, how quickly we trade compassion for the illusion of safety. The vampire does not create our fear, it only feeds on the fear that is already there. So what, then, becomes of faith? If fear is inevitable, if failure is so common, can faith survive without being corrupted into a weapon? The answer lies in the most fragile, most painful possibility of all. Faith not in symbols, not in rituals, not in the promise of survival, but in each other. The kind of faith that does not guarantee safety, but insists on solidarity. It is the faith of two people holding hands in the dark, knowing the monster may devour them, but refusing to face it alone. It is the faith of speaking out when silence is easier, of defending the vulnerable when it paints a target on your back. It is the faith that sees humanity itself as sacred, even when every instinct screams to abandon it. This faith does not erase fear. It does not promise victory. What it offers is something stranger, something quieter, the possibility that even in the face of destruction, we can remain human. And perhaps that is what terrifies us most, not death itself, but the demand that we live fully before it comes. Fear tempts us to shrink, to hide, to become less than what we are. True faith demands the opposite. It demands expansion. It demands that we open ourselves to risk, to pain, to love. It demands that we choose compassion even when compassion feels like suicide. But how many of us are capable of such defiance? How many would choose to stand unarmed before the darkness? Hearts trembling, hands open, far fewer than we want to believe. And so, the story repeats. Again and again. Across towns, across centuries, across our own lives. Fear becomes faith. Faith becomes a weapon. The weapon is turned not against the monster, but against each other. And when the smoke clears, we tell ourselves we had no choice. Perhaps that is the final cruelty of fear, not that it kills us, but that it convinces us we were powerless, when in truth, we always had a choice. And so the question remains, lingering like ash on the tongue. When the next darkness comes, and it will, what choice will you make? Will you surrender to the easy faith that divides, condemns, and weaponizes? Or will you risk the fragile, dangerous, radiant faith that unites, that loves, that refuses to let the night have the final word? When fear becomes faith, and faith becomes a weapon, the story of Salem's Lot is no longer fiction. It is prophecy. The only question is, will you repeat it? Or will you break it? The climax of every horror is not the monster's appearance. It is the mirror it forces us to face. Salem's Lot is less about the fanged mouths in the night than about the faces of the living, warped by fear until they resemble the very predators they flee from. That is the hidden terror. Not that something outside will destroy us, but that, in our frantic grasp for safety, we will destroy ourselves. And perhaps that is why the story resonates like a wound that never closes. We have all known the moment when fear demanded that we choose, speak or stay silent, protect another or protect ourselves, risk compassion or cling to survival. For some, the choice was small, a cruel word ignored, a cry for help unheard. For others, it was larger, a betrayal, a silence that echoed for years. Whatever the scale, the wound is the same, the realization that fear made us less than we could have been. But here is where the story turns, from tragedy to reckoning. Because fear will come again, the night will fall, the knock will sound, the choice will return, and in that moment, you are not condemned to repeat your silence. You are not chained to the mistakes of Salem's Lot, nor to the mistakes of your past. You can choose differently. You can take the trembling in your hands, the pounding in your chest, and let it drive you not toward suspicion, but toward solidarity. You can decide that faith will not be a weapon, but a bridge. Understand this. The true enemy of the monster is not the cross, not the stake, not the flame. It is the act of people standing together in compassion, refusing to fracture, refusing to surrender each other to the dark. Monsters thrive where humans abandon one another. They starve where humans cling, trembling but unbroken. To the truth that survival without humanity is no survival at all. So when the next night comes, and it will, ask yourself, will you lock the door, sharpen your faith into a blade, and wait for someone else to fall first? Or will you open the door, step into the dark, and declare by your very presence that fear will not dictate the story this time? The lesson of Salem's Lot is brutal, but it is also merciful. You always have a choice. You cannot stop the night from falling, but you can decide what it makes of you. Fear can become faith. Faith can become a weapon, but faith, if you dare, can also become love. And so I leave you here, at the threshold, listening to the silence that hums just before the knock. Tell me, when it comes, what will you do?